thank God he lived, right? So
Yeah.
there's a world in which the assassination attempt had been successful. And then, that may have seemed to impact daily life more, like who knows exactly. Somehow it's like something almost broke. That's what, the assassination attempt that failed is things were just barely kept from total catastrophe. So if that had succeeded, then maybe we would feel the impact of history and politics on our lives more directly in a dark sort of way. So that's part of it. But another one is just that events, sometimes by their own nature and sometimes by the fact that they're artificially propped up or suppressed, they can be memory holed pretty quickly. And I think that there's some deliberate attempt to make this assassination attempt go away because it was a sort of triumphal moment for him, the way that he reacted under fire. And it gave him a big boost. And, Democrats can't have the Republicans getting a big boost of any kind. So to demythologize and sort of deflate and move past that assassination attempt, it's both natural, life goes on, right? I mean, you and your friends, what are you going to do? Suddenly, like, you still have your lives to live and things still move on. But still, an attempted assassination on a president where every sort of protective measure failed. And this assassination attempt came after so many other attempts to remove him from the equation. There's a lot of reasons to be suspicious about all of that. But yeah, I would say it's easy for us to forget because there's always some new news in the news. And it's also easier to forget when it's artificially suppressed for electoral reasons. But yeah, it is bizarre though. And you wonder how many more bizarre things can still happen.
Yeah.
And then look, the election, it will change a lot of people's lives. It's going to matter for a lot of people. It's not going to matter for everybody. I mean, there are people who have lived a normal life under many different presidents and many different world affairs. And, the world keeps going. Our lives keep going, sort of regardless, unless we're like extremely closely tied up in political events, which I think most of us are not.
As someone who's deeply rooted in the world of philosophy and politics like yourself, when you look back to other historical assassinations or assassination attempts, because there have been many moments like that throughout history, and there have been many philosophers with genuinely great insights and very relatable insights surrounding these moments of attempted assassinations. Do you see anything interesting with the way that people or smart people have reacted, people that maybe consider themselves philosophers? Do you see anything interesting about the way that they've reacted to Trump's assassination versus the way that philosophers have reacted to historical figures trying to be taken out in the past?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't exactly know, to tell you the truth. So I haven't really looked at how people reacted and responded under other circumstances. But number one, there's the fact that he survived, which again changes the equation to a certain extent. Number two, there's the media environment. Like we live now, and it wasn't exactly the case at other periods of history with this onslaught of the current news. There's always something new shiny thing gathering our attention, circulating, making the rounds. Today it's the Olympic transgender. Tomorrow it's who knows what.
Yeah.
Yesterday it was what it was yesterday. So there's always some new story held in the center of our attention. And there's a general tendency discussed by philosophers like Heidegger in dealing with everyday events. Everybody wants to talk about what's going on, but nobody really hits the nail on the head. Nobody really understands. Like everybody's got a curiosity about what's going on and discusses it without understanding it, resulting in public ambiguity. That's what Heidegger says in his book, Being and Time. And that was true in the COVID period. Okay. Everybody was talking, nobody really understood, and the result was public ambiguity. I think around this assassination attempt too, for some people, it was like, that's it, the election's over. Like you have old man Biden, you have Trump, Biden can't walk up the stairs to Air Force One. Trump just, showed courage under fire. It's like a done deal. And then 2 days later, it isn't. And now if you look around in Republican circles online, depending on whether you're reading comparatively intelligent or comparatively unintelligent people, the idea that Trump could lose is very, very real. And I wouldn't go so far as to say it's likely, but everybody understands that it's, much more possible now than it was when Biden was president. So, these are the circumstances that I don't know. I mean, in some sense, for some people, the event had divine significance because of how, everybody saw the images of Trump turning his head and how close of a call that was. And
Yeah.
you might think, okay, it gives you occasion for philosophizing. Like, what happens to a person who comes so close to death? Is this going to change who he is? Well, it did for about like 5 minutes or 10 minutes, or a day or two, and then it didn't anymore. So that's interesting as well. What happens to a person when he comes close to death? And there are different people, like my neighbor could come close to death. I could come close to death. But when a presidential candidate comes close to death, you think it's going to have greater significance because so many
Mm.
hopes and dreams and so much it depends on a presidential candidate. That doesn't depend on just, anybody you pick off at random on the street. So it was interesting to see how it changed his demeanor. It was interesting to see the credit that he and others gave to divine intervention. But that's difficult too because somebody did die, and somebody in the audience did die. So what are you
Yeah.
going to say? God protected Trump, but didn't protect the other person.
Mm.
So there's all of these sort of details that they can become material for reflection. Like philosophy in general, it can begin to reflect on anything significant in our lives, or even things that are apparently trivial in our lives. They can be matters for reflection. So something like, what does it mean to have an assassination attempt? What is it, what is this brush with death? What is divine intervention? Those are philosophically legitimate questions, but they're not raised automatically. And usually people just bump up for a second and then go back down to where, to their baseline state, whatever it was before something weird happened.
Yeah, I was gonna say it makes me wonder about whether the near death experience is enough to change the way that someone looks upon the world, or looks upon their place in what's happening, or you need some sort of reflection or step back period along with the near death experience. Because someone like Trump or anyone running for president, if they have an assassination attempt committed against them, within minutes to hours, they're already preparing statements. They're thinking of how to make the next political move. There are all these things that are running through their head and being said to them by their political peers that are more about how are we going to respond to this than, how do you feel right now, or how is your soul, how do you,
Right.
like, let's unpack this a little bit. Someone just tried to kill you and they almost did. Maybe take a week to 2 weeks off from the campaign. That's just not going to happen. And yeah, it's just interesting to think about it. If something like that happened to me, and I'm, would it be like some sort of ayahuasca experience or psychedelic experience where it changes how I perceive the world a little bit? Would I just go back to work the next day? Would I record a podcast the next day? Like, what would I do? What's the thing that drives the shift in worldview and the shift in how you view yourself?
Yeah, like I think you could imagine a bunch of different responses. Maybe somebody gets dark and brooding and melancholy, and suddenly they feel like the anxiety of death hanging all around them, or something like that. He seemed to like mellow out for a little bit. Again, I'm talking about the immediate, the few days after.
Yeah.
He softened out a little bit, mellowed out a little bit, gracious and counting his blessings. He still had the comedy and the comedic charm. I don't think, I think only a bullet that hit him could actually put an end to that. Anything short of that, it's not going to work. So, but he's back. Basically, he's back to being himself. He's on the campaign trail doing his highlight reel. But it is important, I think, how he reacted under the circumstances. That was interesting. Not everybody would do that. His description of the obligation he felt to the audience at the rally, I thought that was very moving, touching, raw, genuine, authentic, and all the rest of it. But you're right that, I mean, a minute later, it becomes a question of how it gets spinned, how it gets packaged, how it gets presented. Even if he has every best intention, he's his authentic self. He's got a team of politicos around him, and that's the way it works. So there's one book I read last year called "The Beginning of Politics." It's a commentary on the biblical book of Saul.
Mm.
And the reason I mention it is because one of the main arguments in that book, and again, they're looking at the Bible stories, right? So we're talking about things that are old, but that are still true. So if something's true, it doesn't matter if it's old. And the idea was that politics is always ambiguous when you're doing something out of genuine moral impulse and when you're doing it for your own benefit. Like every political action is ambiguous between those two interpretations. So it's kind of like it's inevitable. Whenever something gets pulled into the political domain, it can always be spun. It's always a question of interest, messaging. It just becomes material in the hands of the political operatives. Even if at some level it is still spiritual, it is still genuine, it is still moral, transformative, existential, whatever, all of these sorts of things. The minute it touches, the minute it falls under the umbrella of politics, it acquires that extra level of ambiguity where it's like, oh, is he saying this because he means it, or is he saying it because it's going to message well? You know,
Mm.
and that's just part of politics. You know, so as an outsider, we always have to sort of, you know, try to at least weigh the balances, like how much of this is genuine, how much of this is messaging, and try to find our footing.
Yeah, and it's also like, does it matter if, no matter how, if someone is, if there's an assassination attempt against someone, if someone has a near death experience, whatever it is, and they're also a politician on the global stage, does it matter if they're actually experience a genuine existential crisis or a spiritual moment, a spiritual reckoning, or is it, does it just come down to how people are going to perceive it? Like you said, people, no matter what someone like Trump says, or any politician at that level, if an assassination attempt happens to them, people are going to perceive it as, oh, this is the thing that's going to rate his campaign highest. This is why he's saying it. He's trying to galvanize the people, and he's trying to just say something that's going to have a positive effect on how others view him. And yeah, I don't know if it is possible to have a genuine existential moment like that if you're in the public sphere, and people are just going to perceive whatever you say as some sort of maneuver.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, people who were commenting on it after the fact, and I think he himself at the Republican National Convention, when he commented on it, he gave the impression that, like, to take the outsider's perspective, he knew it was like a made for TV moment. So it was a genuine assassination attempt. By the way, people doubted that, right? Is it glass? Is it this? Is it that? Was it a setup? Why would they think it was a setup? Because it looked too good. His reaction was too picture perfect. The flag, you know, the fist, the blood. I'm not saying that, right? But I'm saying people who are looking from the outside are so cynical about the manipulation of images that they would entertain the thought that the whole thing was a setup to produce images for the purpose of electioneering or whatever, which is crazy. So, yeah, I mean, I wonder whether people in politics, this is not something I know, but I just wonder, you know, together with you in some sense, whether they have clear insight into their own experiences and are able to distinguish when what they're feeling is like their genuine feeling and when what they're feeling is the sort of the image and the projection and the persona that they have to be for political purposes. I don't know. It probably in the case of Trump, that's even an extra level there because he's been so media savvy for his whole life. Like if you're super media savvy, do you see, you know, you've got your duplicated self. I mean, you do too. I do too as podcast people, YouTube people, right? We're not
Mm-hmm.
just here. We also see ourselves on the screen and hear ourselves in the clips and everything else like that. So the management of a person's image and where they actually feel they're feeling. Like, have you ever seen those experiments where a person is sitting with like a fake arm on the table next to him and his own arm is like under the table, and the experimenter, if they hit the fake arm, like the person feels pain, you know,
Is it?
it's because you identify with this prosthetic limb or whatever it is, something like that.
Yeah, I was gonna. I've seen the one where they use the mirror and they're hit it. They make it. Is that the one that you're talking about, where you're seeing the reflection of your arm? It's not your actual
Yeah,
arm.
something like
Something
that. But
similar to that.
something's
Yeah,
being hit that
yeah,
you feel the pain, even though it's not you, because you've identified with something that's not yourself. So how do you know a politician is constantly not his himself and not himself, you know? So like it's would be difficult, I think, psychologically to really figure out if you wanted to. Trump doesn't seem to me like a soul searcher necessarily, which is probably good. You know, if he was a navel gazer, he could never go back to the campaign trail. There'd be too much to think about. Whereas he's just out there hitting home runs with one-liners and all the rest of it. So
yeah.
yeah, but that's you know that's it's fodder for thinking about what you know the psychology of these assassination attempts and all of that. Not to mention, as I say, the deeper, darker conspiracy theories about like how did this how was this allowed to happen with so much so many telltale signs that something was afoot. You know, you see videos of the shooter running across the roof and things like
Mm-hmm.
that. So that's separately from you know what the assassination attempt. But still, Trump might have thought like, look, I've got a secret security service. They didn't protect me from the basic thing they're supposed to protect me from. Like I've got you know I've got insiders who are against me. But he didn't, right? He didn't say all this sort of stuff. He just went on. So yeah, it's a case study in something for sure. Not everybody would respond like that. I probably wouldn't. You have to think for yourself how you would. But
Yeah.
then again, that's why he's a unique figure in world history, for better or worse.